And really the interest between America, which is on the other side of the Atlantic, and Europe is drifting away since the end of the Cold War. And Trump is merely expressing that. He's a symptom. He's not a disease. And that makes it very important for European countries, including Ukraine, to have a stronger sense of their own autonomy, the need to organize themselves to be able to defend their own interests and values in the world. But what I try to do in my book is, at the same time, it's not the usual story, I should say, we're all going to be one, we're all going to cheer for the European flag, we are building the United States of Europe. Because I do not think that is happening, and I do not think it is a credible story. What is so peculiar and so fascinating is that at the same time, within the European Union, we still have a union of states, of member states, France, Germany, Spain, and others. And at the same time, they learn to work together. So there's now two flags. We have the European flag and all the national flags. And that makes, at the same time, for permanent tensions, because there's always the risk of division among member states. But on the other hand, if you look at Europe's century-old history, with all these nations, with their political cultures, their languages, on such a small space, it is not a sound idea to think that that can disappear into one centralized organization run from Brussels, as others run their states or empires from Washington or Moscow. It's not going to happen like that. There will always be this plurality as a union, and that can work, but it is more difficult.
Do you think that Europe has kind of a natural tendency of enlargement? Because we see European history mostly as a history of enlargement, and that's something very vital for Ukrainians.
Yes.
Because we hope to be EU member one day.
Yes.
Do you think that there is a natural tendency of enlargement, or rather the enlargement has stopped?
I think there is still an inbuilt driving force for enlargement, and that is not only the treaty, which says that any European state can become a member. So if you're a European state, you can apply, and that clearly is the case for Ukraine. Unlike for, let's say, Morocco, which also tried in the past. And their European leader said, no, we're sorry, you're in Africa. In Ukraine, you don't get that answer because Ukraine is in Europe. But it's more than the treaty, I would say. In the end, it is the underlying idea of a European civilization which holds us together, and to which all along European integration history also people have appealed. And I think that's also what, on the Ukrainian side, Ukrainian people and leaders are feeling very, very strongly, that it is also by appealing to that European identity, the underlying identity and values, that you prove in a way that you are a European state. And not only by pointing out the letter of the treaty.
You talk about, in the end of your book, you talk about different strategies: the German strategy, the Roman strategy, and the Greek strategy. What do you mean by that?
Well, this is my way to describe three ways by which European institutions and state have tried to convince their citizens that they are Europeans, and that Europe is good for them. I call German strategy the appeal to a common identity, a common history, a bit like 19th century German nationalism with Fichte and these men, you know them. So there, hence the idea, for instance, to have a European flag, to have symbols or history books. Very complicated. You can also have backlashes, and it's perceived as propaganda, but there were some successes as well. The Roman strategy I call an appeal to bread and circuses, basically. So the Roman Empire, meaning a political order has to provide advantages, goodies for people, and show that you get money out of it, like with agriculture or regional funds, that it is good for, that you have rights and freedoms which you can exercise, you can travel around Europe, students can go on Erasmus and all that. So that is also, let's say, a Roman advantage of being an EU citizen. And the third one I call Greek or Athenian strategy, which is to give people a say. It's about democracy. It's about making people aware that, and not making them aware only, but also creating new institutions, like the European Parliament, which was built so that European citizens can have a place where they are represented as Europeans and other rights. And well, this distinction is a little bit of a small historic joke to give these names, but I think any political system, any political order uses various strategies to build a bond with the citizens. Europe is also doing it, but in the end you need all three, of course. You need an appeal to identity, of we Europeans, and not they Europeans. Because it may surprise you in Ukraine, but of course within the European Union, Brussels is perceived, even in my country, I'm from the Netherlands, as something far away.
Europe inside Europe.
As a foreign occupying power almost. And of course Europe also has to provide advantages and be democratic. So it's not one against the other.
But talking about today's populist crisis, what is more in that? This lack of identity, lack of material resources. We see that some people feel impoverished in Europe as well. All lack of participation, because the populists are saying that the people are no longer governing anymore. And in particular the Italian case, which is, we follow it very closely.
Yes. Well, I think the Italian case, indeed, it is, especially with the five-star movement, the political startup movement, is really an appeal also for more democracy. They have internet voting among members, and it is an attack on the Italian political class, which has lost some of its credibility. But I think it's also, well, it's both against the Italian state, incapable to provide enough jobs and security for Italian citizens and of the European Union at the same time. And indeed, Europe is blamed on both accounts for migration, because many, of course, African and immigrants and refugees from the Middle East are coming in via Italy, and Italy feels left alone by the rest of Europe. Because Africans going to Italy, in their mind, they're not arriving in Italy, they're arriving in Europe. And still they're stuck in Italy, and it's difficult to organize a redistribution of asylum seekers across Europe. And then there's the euro, which is blamed for a lack of growth in Italy since 20 years. Well, it's a nuanced story, because yes, it is more difficult for Italy to be competitive if you're in the same currency union with Germany. At the same time, they have done worse than anybody else, including Greece, if you look at the figures for over 20 years. So there clearly also is a domestic Italian problem, which Italian politicians should attack.
When was the moment that Europe was really present for its citizens? Do you think that we can count this moment from early 50s, or did it happen recently?
No, I wouldn't take it from early 50s. I mean, when Europe was only a market, it was only interesting for businesses, perhaps for farmers, people who had something at stake there. And it was for exports. It is only, I think, with the euro, on the one hand, with the currency, and the crisis over the currency, and with migration, with free movement between borders, so basically the past 10 years, that for ordinary citizens, when they read the newspaper, it is front page news. Often the crisis, Greece, Italy, Germany elections, all over Europe, they're talking about the same stories more or less at the same time. With the euro crisis since 2010, migrant crisis 2015, and there, all of a sudden, Europe became very concrete, and people realized it makes a difference whether you are inside or outside the eurozone, whether you are inside or outside Schengen for borders. And that is a new experience. Many people disliked it, some liked it, but I think it is normal that it takes time, because, well, I'm a historian by training, so I think 5 or 10 years is not a very long time, in fact, if you look at long-term trends. and that this new experience of what it means to be in Europe, what it means to share a border, a southern border, to share an eastern border, another discovery, is relatively new. And I think citizens in Europe, they are not fools. Even if some of their politicians take them for fools, people are not fools. They also look around. They see what's happening in Russia, in China, in Washington, and perhaps they're not always at ease with the way Brussels is run, but at the same time they know that the world is changing and that they have to adapt to that world. And I would wish for more political leaders who would, like Macron in France, who give that message that we are facing a new world with new challenges, new conflicts maybe, and that we can master them.
Maybe my last question, you talk about these pivotal events, you talk about Suez Crisis, then the fall of the Berlin Wall. Do you think that now is happening something very substantial that can also drive Europe in a different direction? And if yes, what is that?
Well, I think the combination of Trump in Washington and Putin in Moscow puts a lot of strain on the whole European state system. We already discussed both a little bit. It makes it it's a strong outside pressure on European states to defend their own interests, their own values in the world, to realize that if we want to survive as a civilization in a way, from Iceland to Ukraine and from Finland to Portugal, we have to work better together. And the war over in eastern Ukraine is a very element of truth in there, obviously. But you know much more about it than I do. But I see it, and it is clear to outside observers that there also the future of Europe is at stake.